Today we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 14, verse 1 through 15, verse 4. And we're not going to go into detail about all of the verses. We'll hit some of the highlights there. But one of the main themes of this chapter has to do with the strong and the weak. And that's a tough one because most people don't know who are the strong and who are the weak. And it's not easy to come up with that answer as well, but it's very important. And there's a few assumptions that we have to make about the book of Romans, or the epistle to the believers in Rome, in order to really arrive at the right answer. And what it means to them, what it meant to them, what it means to us as well. So starting in chapter 14, verse 1, and this is Paul, he's addressing the strong. And he says, "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions." Very important principle. And Paul is really good at these topic sentences, sentences that kind of really summarize what he's going to talk about for the next chapter or so. But skipping to verse 13, "Therefore, let us not judge one another from now on, but rather decide this, not to put a stumbling block or a trap in the way of a brother." So now we're not to judge one another. And then in verse 21, "It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything by which your brother stumbles." So don't do something that's going to stumble your brother. And we still haven't talked about whether he's talking to the strong or to the weak at this point, or who the strong and the weak are. But food and drink is one of the things that he talks about in this chapter, but he also makes reference to certain holy days as well, or at least days that people esteem as holy days. And we'll see what those are. And then, chapter 15, verse 1. See how quickly we're going? We're going to be closing in prayer here in just a minute. "Now, we who are strong." So Paul is identifying with the strong. Whoever they are, he's identifying with the strong in some way. There's even question about that, because he uses an interlocutor, somebody that he has a fictitious conversation with throughout the book of Romans, throughout the epistle. So it's hard to say sometimes when he says we. But let's assume for right now, we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not just please ourselves. Think of the other person. Think of the person who needs our support and our strength. And then going back to chapter 14, verse 23, "But the one who has doubts is condemned if he eats, because it is not of faith. And whatever is not of faith is sin." So there's an issue of conscience here as well. So the answer, what you're concluding may not necessarily be right, but you still have to go by your conscience, and you have to act in faith. So, as you can see, there was a man who consulted with a psychiatrist. He said, "Doctor, lately I've been behaving very badly, and my conscience is really bothering me." So the psychiatrist thought for a moment, "And you want something that will strengthen your willpower?" And the patient said, "Well, no, I was thinking of something that would weaken my conscience." You know what? There's too much truth to that nowadays. I've got a guilty conscience. What can you do about it? And there's a number of doctors that are willing to accommodate. So, shall the strong accept the weak? And we'll kind of find out what that's all about as we go on. But we need a little background to the epistle to the Romans. And first of all, this is one of the major assumptions that I'm going to make this morning, is that the epistle Paul was writing to primarily Gentiles. In other words, Gentile believers in Yeshua who lived in Rome. It doesn't mean that there weren't Jewish people who were reading this epistle as well, and there were issues that involved Jewish people, but he was writing to Gentiles primarily, and for a very good cause, a very good reason. Paul affirms this in several places in the epistle. One of them is in Romans chapter 11, verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry. Gentiles, and here, it's one of the things that he brings out is that Gentiles have a role in bringing Jewish people to faith in Yeshua.
Okay, so Paul's purpose, his purpose here in chapter 14, and really this started at the beginning of the epistle. It really got strong in chapter 12. Chapter 12, Paul is talking about love. He's talking about patience for one another. He's talking about acceptance of one another who are believers in Yeshua. And he really sets up this moment here in chapter 14. His purpose is to strengthen love, unity, mutual acceptance of each other in Messiah, without judging. We've already seen that, without judging. Paul did not begin the congregation in Rome. That's very important as well. Here he is. He's writing to this group in Rome. He's never been there. He didn't start the congregation, unlike most of the other congregations that he writes to. And so, but we do see by the end of the Epistle of Romans, he actually greets more people at the end of Romans than he does in all of his other epistles together. So he has connections there, but he didn't start the congregation. And a little bit of history here too as well. Claudius, he had decreed, I think it was in 49, the year 49, most of the Jewish people were expelled at that time from Rome. And we're not actually sure what caused that. There was even some speculation, according to some writings, that it had to do with proclaiming the good news of Yeshua as well, and that caused a stir in Rome. A lot of scholars are disputing that, and a lot of scholars are disputing the fact that probably not all of the Jewish people were expelled, but a good many of them, and it did affect the congregation of Yeshua in Rome as well. But by the time Paul is writing to them, the Jewish people have already come back, probably for the last couple years. But there were tensions as well. There were many tensions that were rising between the Jewish people and Rome in general. And tensions amongst Jewish believers in Yeshua toward Gentiles, and even Gentile believers in Yeshua as well. And we see that if you read Acts chapter 21, when Paul does come back to Jerusalem for the last time, he has a chance to address thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Jewish believers at the temple, and everything was going really well until he said one word, and that was Gentiles. Then, these are the believers. They rushed him, started to beat him, and then the Romans came in and arrested him. So we can see very clearly that there was a lot of tension at this point, mostly because the Jewish people were not being treated very well by the Romans at this point, and there were a number of different uprisings that were in the makings amongst the Jewish people. So there were just a lot of tension, and this affected what was going on in Rome as well, and what Paul was addressing. But primarily, throughout the book of Romans, Paul is making room for the Gentiles. He is making the case that Gentiles have a role. I want to be careful how I say this. Where the Gentiles have an equal honor within this, and position within the community of believers in Rome, and that there was supposed to be a oneness there. But it's a oneness with a caveat. So he makes room for the Gentiles, full participation in the community, but without conversion. He is always opposed to conversion, especially when Gentiles have it in their mind that conversion is going to mean extra righteousness in their life or necessary righteousness in their life. In other words, converting to Judaism and then following the Torah in its fullness. That's going to add to their righteousness before God. And of course, if you're familiar with the book of Romans, you read chapter 4, he uses Abraham as an example of somebody who was credited with righteousness even before he was circumcised, even before the giving of the Torah. So Paul, he makes that case very strongly for the Gentiles. And for Jewish people, he makes the case, Jewish people remain faithful to the Torah covenant, and they continue to live within the synagogue community. We could also say that at this time, and really we have to think very differently than we do today, at this time, even the Gentile believers were, to some extent, living within the synagogue community. Many of them had been what's termed God-fearers, Yirei Hashmayim, God-fearers who joined themselves to the synagogue without actually converting. And so there were different levels of observance. It was really voluntary on the part of the Gentiles, but they lived within the synagogue community. But then there were other Gentiles who came to faith in Yeshua who didn't have that experience. And yet they were coming into a community that did have a connection to the synagogue. Why was the synagogue so important? Well, because this was a Jewish faith. And the scriptures were at the synagogue. And the scriptures were taught in the synagogue. In other words, the scrolls were there, and they didn't have printing presses for another 1,500 years. And so that's where you learned the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. So there was always a connection to the synagogue for at least through the first century, at least through the end of the first century. And then there started to be what historians call a parting of the ways, which really was tragic. Paul protects Jewish distinction. In all of his epistles, he protects the distinction between the Jewish people and Gentiles. And yet, he protects the oneness of the believers as well. So, in 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24, and I've talked about this one other time, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I call this Paul's long-neglected rule for all the congregations in Messiah. Why? Because Paul says, this is my rule for all the congregations in Messiah. I give this rule in all of Messiah's communities. Was anyone called when he already had been circumcised? Let him not make himself uncircumcised. By the way, this is a clear reference to 1 Maccabees, where that actually happened, literally and in terms of just the people's Jewishness. In other words, there was a Hellenization that was going on at the time of the Hasmonean period, the time of the Maccabees, the time that we're going to be remembering at Hanukkah. And so a number of Jewish people were really trying to undo their Jewishness. It wasn't just their circumcision. They were trying to undo their Jewishness. And they were abandoning the covenant of Torah. They were abandoning circumcision. They were abandoning Shabbat, holy days, the Torah, the Torah scrolls themselves. And it was a very difficult time. But this is exactly what Paul is making reference to here. He's saying, don't do that. Even as believers in Yeshua, when you come to Yeshua, don't do that. Remain Jewish. Don't just remain circumcised, but remain Jewish. And distinctly Jewish. Has anybody been called while uncircumcised? Let him not allow himself to be circumcised. And Paul makes that point because our righteous standing before God does not depend on being Jewish. It does not depend on being legally obligated to the Torah.
It's not an issue. And yet, it comes up in so many of Paul's writings, but it's really the Gentiles who had the problem with this. You know, the Jewish people, for the most part, knew that, grace and forgiveness and atonement is built into the Torah. And so it should have been natural to see Yeshua's atonement as the end goal, as Paul says, the end goal of the Torah and all of the atonement that comes through the Torah, because it ultimately speaks of what Yeshua did for us. But Paul, in that regard, he's against the conversion to Judaism through circumcision. TLV, by the way, means Tree of Life version of the Scriptures. Genesis 12:1. This is where it all started. This is where the distinction between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, or Gentiles, started. Genesis 12:1, now Adonai said to Avram, go forth from your country. And then in verse 2, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And in other words, Abraham's covenant family is going to be a blessing to the nations. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, so this is prophetic. God is making this promise to Abraham. But in order for that promise to be fulfilled, there has to be a distinction between the covenant family of Abraham, which is the Jewish people, and the nations. So at this point, God is dividing the world into two distinct groups. And Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians, back up top here, he's saying, don't abolish that distinction. Keep the distinction. It's important. And it even becomes more important in the believing community, because in the believing community, this mutual blessing, because that's what's being described in Genesis 12, a mutual blessing between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people. Non-Jewish people bless the Jewish people are a blessing to the non-Jewish people. That is to continue, and it becomes even more profound within the kingdom of Yeshua, within his community. And we can see this distinction that Paul is maintaining even in the first couple chapters of Romans. In those first two chapters, 3 times he says to the Jew first and then to the Greek. So he's maintaining that distinction right from the beginning. There's a number of other ways that he does that throughout the epistle as well. He's very careful never to imply, contrary to a lot of interpretation of Romans, he never implies that Gentiles take over the identity of Israel. That's what we call supersessionism. When the church, takes over the identity of Israel. He never does that, and he's very careful to make sure to prevent that as well. So one of the terms that scholars use is to identify the oneness of Jewish and non-Jewish people in Messiah as a superordinate social identity group. You're going to remember that, right? It's not something you bring up in casual conversation, but that's, in sociological terms, that's how it's often described, a superordinate social identity group. Why? Because it's taken from a number of subgroups. The 2 primary subgroups would be Jewish and non-Jewish, or Jewish and Gentile. But within the subgroup Gentiles, there's a number of subgroups under that as well. So, but Paul is bringing non-Jewish people and Jewish people together into one superordinate group. And he does that in a number of different ways in the epistle to the Romans. First of all, in chapter 4, we are all considered children of Abraham. Why? Because our righteous standing before God is based on faith, just like it was for Abraham. And then also he uses the term, not only in Romans, but in other epistles as well, kedushim, the holy ones. And so that's another term that applies both to Gentile believers and Jewish believers in Messiah. And then in Romans chapter 8, those whose minds are set upon the things of the Spirit instead of the flesh. And that's described for both Jewish people and non-Jewish people in Messiah. And then, of course, he just argues, we're one in Messiah. He says there's no longer there Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. I mean, he uses these terms. Now, of course, if you just look around, you see that there's male and female, right? So the context is not an erasing of physical distinction, and it's not an erasing of a distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish either. But he does argue that we are one in Messiah. We are equals in Messiah as well. We have equal righteousness because it's from Yeshua. It's something he earned, not that we earned. And so we have equal righteousness, righteous standing before God because of Yeshua, and equal honor in that sense as well. Honor, by the way, is another very important concept that Paul addresses in the book of Romans. You've probably seen, if you've read it recently, that Paul talks about boasting, not boasting over one another. And so honor and boasting, those are two themes that are very important there, because in the Roman culture, boasting or pursuing honor was competitive. It wasn't something that we can all run a race and we all get a ribbon or a trophy. Right? It's competitive. That's the culture in Rome, and it's also the culture, we could say, in our United States as well. So, two main subgroups. We have the Jewish subgroup and we have the Gentile subgroup, but we're all one in a superordinate group. And then there are other subgroups amongst the nations as well. And that's your sociological lesson for the morning. So, equal honor and no boasting. Paul actually goes to a lot of trouble to recontextualize the concept of boasting and honor as well throughout the epistle. And as I mentioned, it was competitive, much like competition in our workforce, competition in sports in our culture as well. That's the way it was in Rome, and you can imagine that doesn't go well in a congregation, where people are trying to compete for honor against each other in a congregation. It just is not the way God has set things up. So here's some examples, by the way. Romans chapter 3, verse 27. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law or of works? No, but by a law of faith. In other words, again, as I mentioned, we are one as children of Abraham because of how we achieved righteous standing before God. It was through faith. In Romans chapter 11, verse 18, he says, to the Gentiles, he says, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And if we had time to go into this, I would love to do this sometime. But just a study on the olive tree. Because there are some interesting research that's been done recently by a number of key scholars that, I won't go into it right now, but it's very interesting. It's really interesting. You'd be fascinated. Okay, I will. No, just briefly. One of the things that I'm going to introduce a professor. He's actually from Moody Bible Institute, and
he's kind of a rising scholar, especially in the area of Paul's epistles, and he recently wrote a book on Romans. One of the things that he brought out, and he brings out research from many, many scholars, is that when we think of the broken branches, the natural branches that were broken from the olive tree, right? That can be translated differently. Instead of broken, it can also be translated as bent or dislocated. And it would make more sense because the grafting process is not something, you don't take a wild olive branch and put it straight into the trunk of a tree. You put it into an existing branch. It's connected to a branch. So a wild branch is connected to a natural branch. And why is it important? Because when we think of the broken branches, we have this picture in our head of the olive tree and then all of these broken branches on the ground, right? And it's making room for the Gentiles who are grafted into the tree. But instead, what the professor's name is Dr. Brian Tucker. And what he suggests is that bent or dislocated is a better picture because then the wild branches are grafted into those existing branches, and it's consistent with Paul's message in Rome that Gentiles invigorate the tree and invigorate the natural branches and Israel in general. So what he's saying is the Gentiles are engrafted into these bent or dislocated branches to invigorate them. Not to take their place, but to invigorate them. So that's just one little teaser. There's more, but. And one other thing I might say too is, and this is something really to consider within the Messianic community, is that the olive tree does not represent Israel. So Israel, instead of considering the olive tree to be Israel, we could consider it to be the kingdom of God. God's kingdom. In other words, the natural branches, God's kingdom was first established with the Jewish people. And so it's natural for us to think of the Jewish people as natural branches in this kingdom of God. But the kingdom of God is intended to eventually include all of the nations as well, which means that the nations have to be engrafted into this existing tree. So the other reason why that might be important to make that distinction, not to consider the olive tree Israel, is that it really feeds into a supersessionism, a replacement theology. If we see these broken branches on the ground and then Gentiles are grafted into the tree of Israel, and you can see how the logic goes. The Gentile church becomes Israel, and the Jewish people are now on the ground, disconnected from the covenant people of Israel. So you can see how supersessionism can feed into that. And that's why a number of scholars are starting to rethink that a little bit. What exactly does the tree represent? And that's a tough one, but there's a lot of really interesting research that's being done there. So is that interesting? Is that important? It is important in the sense of supersessionism because as we'll see. Romans 14. Still in Romans 14. And back at verse 1, it says, "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of disputes about opinions. One person has faith to eat anything, but the weak eats only vegetables." So the weak doesn't eat meat of some sort. "Don't let the one who eats disparage the one who does not eat. And don't let the one who does not eat judge the one who eats. For God has accepted him." That's the important thing. If God accepts us in our diversity and in our diversity of opinions, then who are we to judge the other person? God has accepted him. Who are you to judge another servant? Before his own master he stands or falls. Yes, he shall stand. The Lord is able to make him stand. Now, the traditional interpretation of the weak and the strong, you might guess, is supersessionist at its core. Most of the time, scholars think, or have thought throughout history, that the Jewish people are the weak. And the Gentiles, who are able to embrace a law-free gospel, are the ones who are the strong. And so the Jewish people just need time to get used to that idea. And oftentimes, even to this day, leading scholars interpret it this way. And by the way, leading scholars, the supersessionists, the ones who think supersessionism is a good thing, they're decreasing quite a bit. So, but even the ones who would be horrified to think that their theology is supersessionist are still falling into these traps. Here's a couple books that I recommend. And Chris, have we had Mystery of Romans here? We haven't had either one. Okay. So this is Chris's homework. He has to review these books before he puts them out. Mystery of Romans, this was written by Mark Nanos. He is not a full believer in Yeshua. He appreciates Yeshua. He appreciates him as a great teacher, possibly a prophet. But he's a Jewish theologian from the wider Jewish community. And 26 years ago, he came out with this book, and it was groundbreaking. How many have read it? 2 of us. 3. 4. What? The what? The red one? Oh, the Mystery of Romans. Okay, so there were a few of you. It's a scholarly book, so it's not easy. It's not easy reading, but it's worth it. It's worthwhile. It's one of the groundbreaking books on Romans. Why? Because 26 years ago, most of the Jewish community still had a negative opinion of Paul. And so Mark Nanos, he comes out with putting Paul into Jewish context and seeing him as very much within the mainstream of Judaism in his thought. And that was groundbreaking. And there's been a number of scholarly works, that have springboarded off of that book. And he's still active today as well. And here is Dr. Brian Tucker, who I mentioned before. He wrote just recently, in the last year, I believe, Reading Romans After Supersessionism. And he really built on Dr. Nanos' work. And I had a chance to talk with him a number of times. Dr. Tucker, he happens to be friends with Mark Nanos as well. So, and they disagree on a few things. If you read both of these books, you'll see that they have some disagreements. But all in all, their trajectory is the same. They're going in the same direction. Dr. Tucker is a Christian. He's a Christian professor. Dr. Nanos, of course, is from the wider Jewish community. And today there is so much research going on along these lines. Christian scholars, Messianic scholars, Jewish scholars from the wider Jewish community, there's so much going on. It's virtually impossible to keep up with it, but it's tremendous because it's eliminating. It really is, as you can see from the title here, Reading Romans After Supersessionism. That it takes you it puts Paul in a whole new light. When you eliminate the idea that Paul was supersessionist. And so, we only get a little bit of a taste of that today. So that's Chris's homework. He has to review those books. So, neither weak nor strong nor Jewish, despite Paul in chapter 15, verse 1, where he says, we who are strong, Paul is still addressing non-Jewish people here, and what Dr. Tucker maintains is He argues that both the weak and the strong are primarily non-Jewish. That this is kind of a tension between non-Jewish people, not so much the Jewish people in the community in Rome. It's not associated with unkosher eating or observance of Shabbat or biblical holy days, even though it kind of sounds that way. If we know who Paul is addressing, we can see that it's not. So Dr. Tucker, this is from his book, Reading Romans and Post-Supersessionist. He notes that within the Roman Empire, Judaism was not the only religion that had purity codes and dietary restrictions. And here's a quote from his book. An Egyptian priest would prefer to die instantly rather than eat pork. While the taste of mutton is reckoned an abomination in the eyes of the Libyan, a Syrian thinks the same about pigeons and others about cattle. Plutarch discusses the requirements of priests of Jupiter to abstain from even touching either flour or yeast or raw flesh. And when the women of Eleusis celebrated the festival of the Haloah, they shared a common meal where everything could be eaten except those forbidden in the mysteries: pomegranates, apples, eggs, and fowls, and certain specified kinds of fish. And this is just a small sampling of the many restrictions, dietary restrictions, based on certain religions within the Roman Empire, amongst different ethnic groups, and certain holy days, what they would consider holy days. And you have to imagine now that Gentiles were coming from a number of different backgrounds, a number of different religions, a number of different ethnic groups, and they were carrying this baggage with them. They grew up, with these festivals. And who was going to tell them that they shouldn't continue in those pagan festivals? Where are they going to find that out? They're going to find it out from the scriptures, which leads some to believe, including me, that the weak are newer believers, that they haven't yet learned from the scriptures, how to deal with the baggage that they're bringing in, the pagan baggage, the restrictions, the dietary restrictions, and the certain holy days that they might esteem over others, and that might even affect their diet on those days. And so there's a lot of evidence to show that this is more likely the issue than any kind of Torah observance, especially knowing that Paul is saying, Jewish people, stay Jewish. Live your life as a Jewish person, and they're living their lives within the synagogue community as well. So they're going to be living like other Jewish people in the synagogue community. The weak were those Gentiles who abstained from certain meats because of the pagan culture they grew up in. They were not abstaining from certain meats according to biblical standards. They avoided things they were used to considering impure or unclean according to pagan standards that they grew up with. And they were probably new to the faith, not educated in the Hebrew scriptures. And if we look at it that way, it makes more sense in terms of Paul addressing the weak and addressing the strong. If we look at it as the weak being newer to the faith and just not as educated in the scriptures, it really takes some of the stigma away from being considered weak. In other words, it's the difference between having a new believers fellowship and having something more in depth for those who know the scriptures better. It would be natural perhaps to divide people up in that way. And I think that's what Paul was doing here. And Jewish people still observed kosher standards
Otherwise, going back to Acts 15, where the letter was sent out to the Gentiles, this is all you have to do. That would have been a meaningless letter if the Jewish people weren't still following the kosher standards. There would have been no reason for that letter. Romans 14:5, back in chapter 14. One person esteems one day over another, while another judges every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes that day does so to the Lord. The one who eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to the Lord. And the one who abstains to the Lord, and he gives thanks to God. So in other words, you might have some misconceptions, but if you're doing it in faith, if you're abstaining from things in faith and you're doing it for the glory of God, there's time for you to learn more about the Scriptures and to grow. And we're not to judge the person who's just starting off in the faith. But you, why do you judge your brother? Why do you look down on your brother? For we will stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says Adonai, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall give praise to God. The one that we're accountable to is God. And that's a reference to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 23. And so then, each of us shall give an account of himself to God. So Paul has been saying at this point, number one, give the new in faith a chance to grow in their understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures and Yeshua's teachings. Accommodate them. Don't rush them along. Accommodate them. Number two, neither should you judge the other. And that goes for the weak, the newer believers and the more mature believers. Don't judge each other. That's what God, that's his responsibility. The strong, more mature in faith, should not stumble the weak into violating their conscience. Give them a chance to grow. In verse 13, therefore, let us not judge one another from now on. And by the way, I'm just going to skip ahead here a little bit. You can see in bold, I hope, that nothing is unholy in itself. So Paul is arguing here that, yes, those who are mature in the faith, they understand that nothing, according to these pagan traditions, nothing is really unholy or unclean or impure. Those are pagan standards. And so Paul is saying, I don't have any problem with this. Although the letter that came forth from the Jerusalem council said not to eat anything sacrificed to idols. So that was something that that was made clear for all of the Gentiles. And down in verse 17 it says, for the kingdom of God is not about eating and drinking, but righteousness and shalom and joy in the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. For the one who serves Messiah in this manner is pleasing to God and approved by men. So Paul is not talking about unkosher foods that are rendered holy for Jews. That's a common translation or interpretation of what Paul is saying here, that all of a sudden now unkosher foods are acceptable for Jewish people. He's not saying that, nor if we go to Acts chapter 10, Peter's vision, when a vision of the unkosher animals coming down on the sheet. God wasn't saying these are all of a sudden now kosher for you, kill and eat. He expected Peter to say no. And the issue was that God was making non-Jewish people clean, pure, and righteous before him, without going through all of the purity rituals in Judaism. So, in other words, righteousness based on faith. And when Yeshua declared in Mark chapter 7, verse 19, declared all foods clean, he wasn't talking about unkosher foods. He was talking about very clearly the issue was eating with ritually unclean hands, not going through the ritual process of washing the hands. So the context, we always have to pay attention to the context. nothing had changed there for the Jewish people. In verse 19, so then let us pursue what makes for shalom and for the building up of one another. Stop tearing down the work of God for the sake of food. And that includes today, if you disagree with me. Don't tear me down. No, I won't tear you down either. Indeed, all things are clean, he says this again, but wrong for the strong in faith man who by eating causes stumbling. So now he's saying those who are strong and don't see a problem with eating these forbidden foods, if you're going to stumble the weak, don't do it. He's laying the responsibility on the strong, not the weak. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything by which your brother stumbles. The faith you have, keep it to yourself before God. But the one who has doubts is condemned if he eats, because it is not of faith. And whatever is not of faith is sin. But again, all of the responsibility comes on the strong, not the weak. The weak, their only responsibility is don't judge the strong. Chapter 15, verse 1. Now, we who are strong, this is Paul talking again, ought to bear the weakness of the powerless and not just please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, for building him up. For even Messiah did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insulted you have fallen upon me. So Messiah, Yeshua, he took the insults that we deserved, and he took those upon himself. And we ought to bear the burden and even shame on behalf of others as well. Romans chapter 12, verse 9. This is going back a couple chapters. And I mentioned the whole chapter 12. It's a wonderful chapter. It's a wonderful chapter of instructing us to encourage one another, build up one another, love one another, accept one another, have patience with one another, don't judge one another. He spends a whole chapter on this before he even gets to the issue of the weak and the strong. And he's setting up his argument and one other argument as well that we won't get to today. Paul is doing this for the Gentiles in Rome. He's creating space for them, that the Gentiles have an equal place within the community, the Messianic community. This is one way he expresses it in chapter 11, verse 25. For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own eyes, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Paul is drawing a connection here between the faith of non-Jewish people from the nations, and they're provoking the Jewish people to faith in their own Messiah. As it is written, well, let's see here, verse 26, and in this way, the fullness of the Gentiles coming in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer shall come out of Zion, he shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. He's not saying that the non-Jewish people are coming in and replacing Israel, and so all Israel will be saved, even though some people interpret it that way. He's saying that non-Jewish people will provoke the Jewish people to jealousy so that the Jewish people en masse will come to know Yeshua as their Messiah. Paul is preparing the Messianic community in Rome to be a launching pad into Spain, even though it probably never came to that, but he was making plans. Gentiles in Rome need to know that they are fully welcomed and valued within the community. The Gentiles need to be welcoming of one another, the weak, the newer in faith, and the stronger, the more mature believers whose lives have been transformed through time, not right away, not instantly. Their lives have been transformed by the Scriptures and the Holy Spirit. Unity and welcoming one another despite disagreements. Now, I could really start an argument, which I'm not going to do, but we have Hanukkah and Christmas coming up. And I bet you we have some people in here who celebrate Christmas, and some who would rather die than celebrate Christmas. I hate to say it that way. And we're not going to get into that, right? Because that's part of what Paul's saying too. There's diversity within the community. And by the way, I'll disclose my practice. I don't celebrate Christmas. I haven't, but I love Christmas lights. I love Christmas music, and some of the food. Not the Christmas ham, but I do like some of the food. And my wife and I both, I'll throw her under the bus too, we both like some of the Hallmark Christmas movies too. So we got a thumbs up. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot of beauty to the holidays, and my family's looking forward to Hanukkah. And yet we enjoy the celebrations that go on around us as well, and the point being, and by the way, which is the biblical holiday, Christmas or Hanukkah? It's kind of a trick question. I mean, the Christians, will celebrate the birth of Yeshua at Christmas. So the birth of Yeshua was biblical, but the holiday came much later. In the case of Hanukkah, there's no commandment to celebrate Hanukkah, and the events came between the end of the writing of the Tanakh and the beginning of the Brit Hadashah. But we do see, and you can look this up for yourselves, in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, in the wintertime, at the festival of dedication is Hanukkah in Hebrew, Yeshua was walking in the temple. He was at the temple at Hanukkah. That's the point that the gospel writer was making. Just a little blurb there. So in a sense, we could say that Hanukkah is a biblical holiday as well. But it's important in a historical sense as well. So, and we're not going to have any disputes over Hanukkah and Christmas, right? We're going to wish each other happy holidays and have a joyous time. And have a joyous time with us next Shabbat as well at 4 o'clock. The tensions between the weak and the strong in faith were not over Torah observance. Abraham's justification by faith involved a different issue. We've already made that point here. So, I think this is the last slide here. Let's just see. I want to make sure I'm closing here. So, Jews in Rome lived as Jews. They were part of the synagogue community, but as were most of the Gentile believers to one extent or another as well. They did what all other Jewish people were doing. They ate kosher meats. They followed the synagogue rules of conduct, which included applications of the Torah. They circumcised their children, observed Shabbat and Jewish holy days. They did what Jewish people did because they were still part of the community until the tragic parting of the ways, which came as we got into the 2nd century. Gentiles were given a decree by the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 and were given very limited legal obligation. And that's the key there. They were given limited legal obligation to certain Torah commandments. Although the Gentiles had freedom, just like the God-fearers had even before Yeshua's community, they had freedom to participate in the Jewish community to whatever extent they chose. And a lot of times that just came from a love for the Jewish people, a love for the scriptures as they learned the scriptures more. So that's just how things naturally progressed. Paul begins and ends his letter to Rome affirming to the Gentiles that their faith in Yeshua is a Jewish faith, and it's grounded in the Hebrew scriptures. In Romans chapter 1, verse 2, it says, concerning his son Yeshua, born of a descendant of David. And then at the end of his epistle, toward the end, he says, he quotes Isaiah. Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. In him the Gentiles shall hope. So Paul, in a number of places, he makes clear from the Hebrew Scriptures, it was always God's plan to have Yeshua the Messiah reign over the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, as well as the Jewish people. And in him, we are one group, and we worship together. And even though there are distinctions between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, we're one. We're one in Messiah. We worship together as one. And that's really what Paul is emphasizing in Romans. He's emphasizing the oneness that we have and the love that we have and the support that we have for one another, and that we have equal righteousness and honor before God because of Yeshua. Let's all stand together. Avinu Shabbat Shemayim, our Father who is in heaven, may we purpose in our hearts to do as Paul did, to strengthen each other in love and unity and a mutual acceptance of each other in Messiah, just as the believers in Rome were instructed by Paul. We come from a diversity of backgrounds, beliefs, and traditions. We thank you that you have accepted us as we are, and we're determined to do the same for each other. We know from your word that we're to allow each other time to grow and to be molded and shaped through knowledge of your word and the work and the power of your Holy Spirit in our lives. And may this be a joyous season of remembrance, remembering your miracles and deliverances, your eternal love and care for us, evidenced through our Messiah Yeshua. In you there is fullness of joy, B'Shem Yeshua.